All right, so I'm going to lay out the K-12 education system and the importance of trust and the admin slash teacher relationship. And I'm going to do it in four parts. So let me lay out those four parts for you, sort of as just a map of where we're going to try to go during this. So I'm going to lay out the big picture of K-12 education and what I think it looks like and why it directly ties to relationships and trust and all of that. The second part is I'll break out the bigger of the aspects of the admin teacher relationship because I think that that is the most interesting relationship that there is. And then third, I'll actually draw a causal loop diagram of that of that teacher admin relationship and discuss kind of some of the implications of how it fits together or doesn't fit together, whatever the case may be. And then last but not least, we'll look at a couple of behavior over time graphs just to get a feel for how things can build or how things can sort of collapse depending on what people are doing inside the system. So let's start right here with the big picture. And if you think about schools, there's three major components. You've got admin, you've got students or kids, right? And one of the fascinating things about K-12 education is admin is often measured on the success of the students, right? But here's the fascinating thing is that they hardly have any direct contact with kids, maybe at recess or disciplinary stuff. The most direct contact with kids is with those teachers, right? This scenario is what changes the game for students. This is what they value. This is what they think when they look back is the most important aspect of it. And admin, really, their biggest leverage point is with teachers, right? And this specific connection is the one that's interesting to me and is the one that I have spent the most of my time, most recently, last couple of years, and then most of my career thinking about is what are the ways in which admin can build trust with teachers? What are the ways in which teachers can build relationships and trust with admin? Because I believe it directly affects the ability that we have in classrooms as teachers with the most direct contact with students, but it has everything to do with this relationship, okay? So if we jump to number two, second part of what I'm trying to do, let's break that relationship out for a second and talk about what are there's sort of two big categories when it comes to this admin-teacher relationship. There's operational, which is all of the sort of nuts and bolts of school. The kinds of things that we think about are, curriculum decisions, schedule, staff meetings, department meetings, the coordination pieces, right? Those are sort of the operational pieces, and these can take a lot of time of administrators or staff or both. But the more important one, or the kind of the connective tissue of the school, is the relational side, right? And what are the relational components between staff and administration? So Megan Tangen-Morin has done a lot of work on relationships in schools, and her biggest idea is that trust is the most essential characteristic, right? That without trust, we don't have a hope of really building long-term change, and especially in a system that's sort of indirect control like this. So when it comes to trust, there are 5 components that she lays out, which I'll list here and talk about briefly, and then we'll draw them in a second. So the first is benevolence, and benevolence primarily is me having good intention and goodwill towards you, right? Having your back, believing that what's important to you is also important to me, and acting in accordance with that. Connected to benevolence is confidence, right? So can the principal or the administrator actually do the job that the teacher is asking him or her to do, right? Do they have the game to actually do that? benevolence opens the door, competence keeps it open, right? Over time, benevolence can go up if teachers see an administrator as competent and doing what they said they were going to do. The other three aspects of trust are honesty, and this by and large is exactly what it means, right? Can we trust what the person says? Do they say what they mean? Do they mean what they say? And then the one that's also related to this is reliability, which you could really think of as honesty over time, right? So if they said they were going to do it on a Thursday, and you come back the next Tuesday and they either haven't done it or they've done something completely different, we would say this makes them both dishonest and unreliable, right? Whereas if over time you see, oh, they're going to kill themselves to do that because they made me a promise, then we would also see that administrator as reliable, right? And then last but not least is openness. And openness is a fascinating one to think about because it's really a measure of how often or how well does an administrator share her resources, her information, her influence, her decision making, etc. Right? One of the ways you can get at openness in a school system is to ask the teachers, when's the last time that Ms. Adams shared decision making, right? Or can you tell me the last time she shared information with you that she didn't have to share with you, right? And if they sort of scratch their head and it takes them a while, then you could probably say, oh, yeah, it hasn't happened in the last 6 months, or they can't think of an instance when it's happened in the last 6 months. This is probably not that open of a system, right? Or they don't view Ms. Adams as that open of an administrator when it comes to that, okay? So taking these 5, let's jump to the third part and draw the causal loop of these, okay? And this actually gets kind of fun. So admin and teachers are my 2 big groups that I'm focusing on. Okay, but the variable in the system, the thing that I think is the most critical piece, is teacher trust, right? So if you think about this as a stock, how much teacher trust, right, is there between administrators and teachers? And obviously both groups feed into this, and I'll break that out more in just a second. So I'm going to draw the admin ones first because it's easier to see. So let's break these out. Let's take benevolence, for example, right? How benevolent is the administration towards a specific teacher or towards the whole staff if you wanted to make it more of a collective thing, okay? Can those teachers specifically reference occurrences when Ms. Adams has shown benevolence towards them, right? Connected to benevolence, as I mentioned earlier, is this idea of competence, right? So how competent is that administrator in view of his or her teachers, right? So can they point to specific places where, yeah, this was a really challenging situation and, you know, Mr. Roberts did a great job, or Mr. Roberts, this was a really irate parent and was ready to go crazy, and he's the one that helped me navigate that and take the pressure off and let me do my job in my classroom. Again, these 2 reinforce each other, all right? The more benevolence you have in the system, the more competent people are going to see that administrator. The more that administrator shows competence, exercises competence, the more benevolent teachers will actually read that administrator, okay? Similarly, let's talk about honesty. Right? Do teachers believe the administrator when he or she says something or when they say they're going to do something? And then tied again to honesty is that idea of reliability. And you can ask, if you ask teachers how reliable is this administrator, you're going to get both. You're going to tie into both of these, right? You're going to get stories about reliability, but you're also going to get stories about honesty or dishonesty, whichever the case may be. And then last, but certainly not least, which I'll put over here, is openness, right? And how does that tie into teachers? And this again, you can think about this in terms of how do they share information, how do they share influence, how do they share decision making? All of those are sort of big categories, but they tie directly into how open or vulnerable is that administrator to his or her teachers, and is there a dialogue, right? Is this a two-way street? This is a hard one for administrators because often they have much more information or more personal information that sometimes isn't in their best interest to share, or they don't want to share, or there's legal ramifications, whatever. But this is a real-time measure, right? The competence, honesty, and reliability, those are longer-term categories. Openness, you can say last week was my administrator open with me, right? And can I come up with an example or not? And so you can take that for whatever it's worth as we go along. All right, which leads me, last but certainly not least, to look at behavior over time graphs. Sorry, let's back that up. Okay, and so if you think about, okay, what is the trust in a general way in this system, and you go from low to high, and here's time, right? One of the fascinating things to think about is that ideally, right, an administrator would want this to build over time. It may not be linear, but you definitely want it going up from left to right, right? This is sort of the ideal state or the hoped for outcome. In reality, what happens is that as you think about teachers' trust over time, it'll go up and down, right? Now, overall, maybe it's a trend up, okay? But here's the important thing I think to consider when you look at all of these facets is betrayal, right? Betrayal can make this sucker drop fast, right? So if you've ever heard that there's a kind of a famous saying that trust is gained in drips and lost in buckets, right? Well, those buckets are the betrayal buckets, right? The ways in which the times when you thought you were heading towards a certain direction, you thought the expectation you had of the leader was that this X or Y or Z was going to happen, and they completely go a different direction. No warning, very little justification or justification that you don't agree with, and that's a betrayal, right? And so one of the fascinating things to think about is you can do all this work over time, but with a betrayal, this is sort of like the stock market, right? The last couple of weeks with coronavirus, right? You can wipe out gains from several years in just a couple of days, all right? The other piece to this that I think is important and interesting to think about is the magnifying effect of staff, right? Of colleague to colleague relationships. So for example, if Margaret feels like she's betrayed, right? And then she shares that with a staff member, a friend of hers, and they also think she's betrayed. Now all of a sudden this betrayal, right, is not just one single person that an administrator needs to deal with. It's several people, right? It's starting to affect the whole system. And this is absolutely a reinforcing loop, right? You can have one bad interaction, not do the makeup work to fix that, and end up with quite a brutal situation across your whole staff, as opposed to just the one person that you need to do the work with. So again, keeping track of the big picture, right? Admin, teachers, kids, how that trust actually works and what's going on there, and then what can your system look like in terms of its behavior over time, I think are all important facets for us to consider when we think about that admin-teacher relationship. Thank you.